Welcome to the Tellabs Optical LAN Troubleshooting Series video, Traffic Management on the PON. The purpose of this video is to introduce concepts and tools for providing adequate traffic management for services that share a PON interface. The topics covered in this video will be an overview of PON service traffic, the process to provision proper bandwidth allocation in the service profile, and ways to monitor the PON traffic. Before the introduction of Tellabs FlexSim OIU8 cards, legacy PON cards were restricted to GPON interfaces with the maximum of only 32 ONTs and up to 128 uniports. The new OIU8 card expands the PON to a maximum of 64 ONTs and up to 512 uniports. In addition, the OIU8 card can support both GPON and XGS PON protocols. In many upgrade scenarios, the system is expanded by adding OIU8 cards, but the ONTs remain GPON. This expands the number of ONTs and uniports that can share a single GPON port. Considering that GPON is 2.4 gig downstream and 1.2 gig upstream, extra care must be taken to make sure that the bandwidth for the PON port is not overallocated. Overallocating bandwidth on the port can cause uniport services to shut down inadvertently. Bandwidth overallocation will cause a resource limitation alarm. A better understanding of the dynamic bandwidth assignment process is required to avoid unintended outages on the network. Dynamic bandwidth allocation of service is provisioned in the service profile. The service profile provides the parameters for rate shaping the service on the PON. Because of the nature of PON, the upstream rate shaping is the most important to address. A UBR class of service, or best effort eligibility, is used for services that are bursty in nature, such as internet browsing or file sharing. For services that have a constant upstream requirement, such as security cameras, a higher class of service may need to be used. When using UBR for a service, the service is allowed to reach a maximum peak rate set in the profile. Whenever the service is not using bandwidth, the unused bandwidth is always shared on the PON span with other services. Along with the peak rate, there is also a sustained or assured bandwidth setting. This is the minimum bandwidth that will be available to the port. If the system cannot maintain the sustained rate, it may be blocked to support higher priority services on the PON. For best results, it is better to set the sustained rate to a lower bandwidth or limit the number of services on the PON to provide some bandwidth sparing on the GPON interface. To see the total allocated bandwidth on a PON port, locate the desired PON port in the tree view. Right-click and select Properties. The Status tab provides information on the bandwidth usage and availability on the PON. It is a good idea to consult this information before adding new services to an existing port to ensure adequate bandwidth availability. A threshold crossing alarm can also be established on the PON to create notifications when a certain percentage of bandwidth is being used. Threshold crossing alarms are established in the PON profile. The receive CIR alarm signals when the combined committed rates exceeds the percentage of the total guaranteed bandwidth on the PON. The receive EIR alarm signals when the bandwidth utilization on the PON exceeds the indicated percentage of the total bandwidth on the PON. This concludes this video. In it, you have learned an overview of PON service traffic, the process to provision proper bandwidth allocation in the service profile, and ways to monitor the PON traffic.